Good afternoon, councillors, staff and those of us who are joining us online. I'll open this hearing for the General Policies Reserve Management Plan. There are no apologies that I've been made aware of. Just a note for those joining online, we have had a couple of people who were going to be presenting to us today unable to attend. One person who was going to be our last speaker, we've asked to come forward, so we're waiting on them to arrive, and another who we've been unable to make contact with. So what I'm going to do is adjourn the hearing until they arrive, and we will resume hopefully within the next 10 to 15 minutes. We are adjourned.
Yes, you can tell what he's talking about. You see who he's talking to.
They're a club. They're a section.
So the money from all 24 machines goes into the main.
Come and have a seat. Councillors, I'll reconvene the hearing. The live stream's resumed once again. Kieran, would you like to come up and have a seat? Jess, you feel free to join them. One of those will tip backwards wildly.
Really?
No. Thanks for taking the time and responding to our call to please come now, because we've had a few people withdraw. So you've got the full attention of all of Council bar one. Thank you very much for your written submission, which we've had the chance to read through. This is your opportunity to speak to it. Normally we're pretty tight on the old time thing, but I've been presented with a degree of flexibility this afternoon, so really the floor is yours.
Kia ora tātou, ko Jess Domigan tōku ingoa. Thank you very much for this opportunity to come and speak to our submission. As I said, I'm Jess Domigan, General Manager of Regional Leadership and Performance at Active Southland, and I'd like to introduce my colleague Kieran Wall, who's with us for special projects at the moment. So I'll hand over to Kieran.
Cool. Thank you. Kia ora everybody, nice to be here. I've had a long connection with Invercargill through my wife, and we've kind of settled here about 6 weeks ago, so I'm pretty fresh into the role, so it's quite nice to be here, kind of making some connections and meeting people and getting the opportunity to speak to you. For Active Southland, this is a slightly new way of working. We are really trying to lift our focus more into that strategic space and work more strategically with ICC as well. We've got a raft of values that are important to us and trying to ensure that we are kind of moving up from scratching around the edges to trying to support you guys to really make Invercargill a better place to live, work and play is going to be a key focus for us moving forward. We've really valued the opportunity to work with your parks team to feed into this process. Currently and so far, we felt our feedback has been really well listened to, and we're seeing some changes that we'd like to see in that document already, which is fantastic. And we'd really like to see this way of working continue, not only with your parks team, but with other facets and teams within council, as we think we can support you guys really well to connect with our communities and to really kind of help continue to move Invercargill forward. This coming back to the RMP specifically, we feel that the document so far and at the state that it's in already creates great guidance for community and you guys as the regulatory authority for those reserves. So we think that there's a way that it can really help to make clarity and a better understanding of how reserves can be used for those who have got lease agreements, those who use them recreationally, and for those who regularly use reserves through sport and active participation opportunities. Our core focus areas, which you can kind of see if you have an understanding of our strategy, but we've really tried to pull them out so it's quite simple for other organisations such as the councils to understand. So our first one for the purpose of this document is active transport. So ensuring that our reserves are connected and they're built in a way that allows people to walk, skateboard, scooter, bike, to get around the city is a really safe way of doing so. And it meets our overarching ambition and goal, which is to get more people more active. So it's better to be on a bike in a nice safe reserve than it is to be sat in your ute, kind of sat. We don't have too much traffic here, fortunately. It's one of my favourite things about being here, but better to be on a bike than in a ute sat at traffic lights. And if you're away from cars when you're doing that, that's a much more pleasurable experience, which means you're more likely to do it with your family and you're more likely to do it more often. Our second point is universal design. So we've got a core focus as an organisation on disability and inclusion, which I think is fantastic. My background is in that space. I worked at Tauranga City Council for a number of years as an inclusive cities officer. And I think universal design is a great way to ensure we're including everybody. Doesn't matter if you're a wheelchair user, doesn't matter if you're a mum with a new pram or a delivery guy hauling a box of new laptops into the City Council's new office. You make it easy for people to get in, you're included, you feel valued, and our public spaces and parks are fantastic places to do that, and they really signal to your community that you are included, you are valued, and we want you here. What I would encourage you guys to ask questions of your staff is around wording where we're unintentionally creating caveats to design people out. So words such as where possible, where there's an identified need. They end up unintentionally designing people out of spaces because you find an excuse not to do it. Because someone hasn't told us we need to do it means we often don't do it. Because where possible means if you find a barrier, we just don't bother. So let's try and rephrase those words and be like, we want you here. It doesn't matter what your need is, we want you here. We see you, we value you. We're not going to say these 3 parks you can come to if you use a wheelchair, but the rest we don't really want you at, because that's what you're unintentionally saying when you use those phrases. Southland, based on older census data, because the new stuff hasn't been really released very well, is that Southland does have a higher rate of disability than the rest of the country. And as your own assumptions for the future look at, we do also have an increased or higher rate of elder people in this city. So accessibility and inclusion are going to become more and more needed and prevalent in this city. So we can, if we build things in now, it's going to save us money in the future. It's going to mean we've got a place that people want to stay. It means we're going to have a place that people feel valued, feel seen, and feel comfortable in, which is really important. Feeding into that is park furniture. So really for us, we've pulled that out specifically for the reserves. So all we're talking about is healthy, active, and utilised reserves. Places where people feel safe, where they want to stay, where they feel they can come with their grandparents or grandchildren or wider family to celebrate themselves, to be active. And we think this can be done through being proactive, making decisions that lead to creating safe, inclusive spaces. So looking at where small changes can be made to benches or to footpaths, utilising shade is a really important piece of work. A lot of cities around the country are looking at shade planning because our summers are getting hotter and hotter and hotter, which means that it's not safe to be outside for so long. So having somewhere where you can pull your 5-year-old aside, sit in the shade and drink some water from the water fountain that's in the reserve is a really, really valuable asset and needs to be built into our reserve planning, because otherwise our beautiful natural environment is going to become unusable before too long. We have worked with the council and other councils across the region to develop the Southland Sportsfield strategy and the Spaces and Places strategies, which are really fantastic pieces of work. It's really critical for us that we see those mentioned and referenced in this RMP, general purpose RMP, to ensure that we're not wasting our energy, that stuff is being cross-pollinated and that those ideas are relevant. I'll try and move myself on quickly now, sorry. Play is increasingly important. You can see that through Sport New Zealand, their strategies. You can see it through the work we're doing, and you guys have done by recently appointing Damien Puddle in a play activation role. It's really important that play doesn't just focus on children. Everybody plays. Intergenerational play is critical, and I think ensuring that that is captured and is a key theme that runs through this documentation is going to be really important for making Invercargill and Southland a place where you can live, work, and play. We talk about it a lot. What do we mean by play? And I'd encourage you to really think about that and ensure that it's captured. And not only in reserves, that was my last little note there. Play happens everywhere. It's not just in playgrounds. It's on our streets. It's in our malls. It's at home. It's all over the place. So let's think about it in the broadest sense possible. We were really encouraged to see mention of the CPTED principles. So that's crime prevention through environmental design. So it's not just CCTV cameras. They are useful. They are a great tool, but having activated places that are filled with people is the best way to prevent crime. So let's look at how we can do that in our parks and reserves, as well as our civic precincts and our city centres. And the last point that we've got here was around climate change. So we're seeing more and more pressure on our reserves, whether it's flooding or saturated ground during the winter or dry, harsh conditions in the summer. It's increasingly having an impact on where and how people are able to enjoy our parks and reserves. So we'd really encourage council to look at some other work that can be done around asset resilience and planning and development to ensure that we are moving forward with confidence and we're not putting plans in place for reserves that actually are just going to be underwater, whether they're floodplains or whether in summer they're going to be so dry we're going to struggle to get grass coverage in the future. So have a look, see where we can implement that into this so that we're ahead of that curve. And that's all from me, unless Jess, you've got anything to add?
Thank you, Kieran, and welcome to Southland. Obviously, your former role in local government makes you very approachable. Can I ask? You've singled out the where possible terminology that we've used. So can I ask you to expand on that and go, well, how do we cope with inadvertent barriers that are there currently that we need? Do we need to recognise them, but with a view to how we overcome them?
I think that's a really good question.
Thank you.
I think often the number of barriers that we create in our society we've created them, so which means we can actually unpick them, which is really valuable to understand. There are always going to be barriers that are insurmountable at times. However, I can think of a couple of examples where you can navigate that. You're not necessarily going to create full access, but you can create some. So in my role at Tauranga City Council, we had people that wanted to enjoy the beach, which is our most beautiful resource other than Mull in that city. And we worked and looked extensively and found some beach matting, which are bright blue mats that were designed for wheelchair and pram use. And we spent not a huge amount of money on about 200 metres worth of beach matting, and we rolled that out, and we worked with Surf Lifesaving and other organisations so that wheelchair users could have access to the beach, because currently they're excluded from going to the beach with their family, which also means if you're the parent of a child and you're a disabled adult, your child might not get to go to the beach with their parent, and that is a huge opportunity loss for them as well as you. And the other barrier I mentioned is Mull, which is a beautiful monga at the end of the headland, 210 metres above sea level, and you do it in a very short period of time. And the council had worked extensively with the Mull Trust, which was when the land was transferred back to Māori ownership through quite an extensive period of time and process. But some of the work there was around removing vehicle access from Mull to protect it, which meant that the kind of arrangement where the Surf Lifesaving Club would run someone up in their little buggy to the top so that they could access and see the views was no longer possible. So we worked with the trust to find an innovative solution, which was a buggy that how's the best way to describe it? Basically a really, really flash wheelbarrow with one wheel underneath it, comfortable seat, had an electric battery that meant that you weren't pushing it, it kind of pulled itself, 2 people at the front, 2 people at the back, someone in the middle, and you could navigate the tracks and trails as a family or a whānau or a group of friends to get that person to the top. So I really believe where there's a will, there's a way. If we use words like where possible, we're already going, it's too hard. So it will always be possible. There are going to be exceptions to that, but if you take the approach of innovation, you can find a way to achieve it, and it's not always very expensive. I think there's often a perception that inclusive access is hard, it's expensive, but that's not necessarily the case.
Great, thanks, Kieran. Grant, then Leslie, and then Tom.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. 2 questions. One, particular thought to how we activate different reserve areas within the city. Probably in my mind it's Queen's Park, some of the areas in South City, but equally Sandy Point, which I think everyone around this table recognises a significant strategic resource for our city in terms of wellness and health and play and all those sorts of things. But I'd be really keen to hear your thoughts or to get insights back at some stage around how we can leverage up those assets for the benefit of all community. And the second thing is around who pays. There's clearly benefit, right, for wellness, for activity, for play, all those sorts of things. Is it a burden? And I think through Active New Zealand, I'd be really interested in what their view is does it just fall on local ratepayers? What is the central government's role in supporting initiatives locally? And if you use that example of Sandy Point to activate that in some of the ways you've talked about with Tauranga, so that people benefit and we do get those long-term benefits of our reserves and activity for local people, but it not necessarily falls to local people to pay.
Yeah, I think two really good questions, and I'll start off by I've lived in a lot of places in the last 10 years in New Zealand and overseas, and Queen's Park is a genuine jewel, and the city should be so proud of that. reserve. It's incredible, and I think it's naturally activated to a point. But I agree with you. We should be exploring how to make the most out of that jewel and how to ensure that residents here are really enjoying it and getting the opportunity to. Because I'm sure there's a lot of tourists that drive into town and see the sign, park up, and it's probably the one thing that they remember most about going to Invercargill, potentially. How many of our residents are using that weekly? How many are really, really getting the best benefit out of that? And I think that would absolutely, I'm 6 weeks into my job, but absolutely be a piece of work. I'd be really keen to work with you on around how we can best activate that and think about kind of get some blue sky thinking. We've got a really, historic and beautiful reserve here, but what can we do to ensure that it stays relevant, that people are using it, that people are valuing it, and that it's fit for purpose for the Invercargill of the future. As for who invests in parks and reserve moving forward, I think it's something that specifically can be looked at around partnerships. Simplistically, if it's for the residents to some extent will always be expected to pay for things, I guess, but I don't know the answers around specifically what opportunities there might be from central government funding to support that. I'm sure there are some, and again, I think it's something that we could, through our Spaces and Places portfolio and other elements around active transport and play, could certainly look at working with the council around understanding further.
Well, I think it's a role that Active New Zealand could take forward to the government on the behalf of local authorities and working with Local Government New Zealand, because we all know the benefits, but, just everything keeps falling back to the ratepayer, infrastructure, water, we all see the benefits and want these things, but we've got to have a fairer share of revenue.
Yeah, I think,
Nice question, Grant.
Sorry.
right. Sport New Zealand, I think, is who you're referring to, and definitely they see themselves as a player in that, in advocating. Definitely for Active South and our refined kind of strategic actions and points talks to insights and giving you the evidence and trialling things kind of that safe to fail, because we can through funding routes through Sport New Zealand to try to activate these areas. So there's definitely opportunity, and we're really keen to explore what that might look like. Yeah.
Thanks, Jess. Leslie.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chair. Karen, first of all, congratulations on the beach matting in Tauranga. I have family there and I've seen it in use, and it definitely has made a difference. So my question, where would you start with the universal design principles?
That's a great question. The number one, having spent time in a council with that being a core component of my job, the starting point is actually getting the organisation to value it, because it's simple things like roading engineers caring about it, knowing about it, thinking about how they design people into spaces, thinking about how your planning team, what their knowledge base is around universal design. There's some odd little design features you see around the country. You might walk into a new bath, it's probably an example here. We've built a beautiful new bathroom in a lovely reserve, and you go into the standard stalls and you've got sensor taps and nice clean, everything's fantastic. You go into your accessible toilet and you've got a lever tap, because the code written in 1980s says you need a lever tap in your bathroom for your accessible bathroom, not considering that technology changes and actually a sensor tap works best for everybody. So if you've got the knowledge in the region and you've got people that are invested in universal design on your roster as staff, you will start to see those little changes made, because they'll just question it and be like, we can do better than that. The code says this, but this supersedes the code. And that's a great way of looking at how council can influence the design and functionality of the city as a whole. And then you can look at key little projects when something's coming up that might be a multi-purpose site that's developed in the future, ensuring that one of the key values of that piece of work is universal design, and that those tools are implemented throughout it. There are really good examples of design guides in Auckland, City Council's design guide, and LifeMark, which do a whole lot of stuff around inclusive design as well. But I think ICC as an organisation taking some ownership and pride of that in the work that they're doing, upskilling yourselves to some extent as well. So you've got a good understanding of what it is, and asking your teams when stuff gets presented to you, what are we doing to include this? Has universal design been considered? Is a really key part of that process. And I think the influence can be very broad spread, and it doesn't need to cost the ratepayer or council a huge amount if that's what you're influencing, because it's thought leadership and it's around wanting to include everybody in our city.
Thank you very much.
Tom?
To some extent, Leslie's question was very similar to mine, but I guess the universal access issue is something that is probably always at the back of our minds. But how do you bring it to the front of your mind so that it's something that you're actively thinking about? And I guess from where we are today to where we might aspire to be, as a combination of policy and funding, isn't it? But on the matter of policy, I just wondered whether, to the extent to which you've been able to look at the policies of the city, this city, and I guess specifically parks and recreation, to what extent do they point us in the right direction with respect to universal access? Or have we got a lot more work to do? Do they not point us at all in that direction?
I think from what I've seen so far, there probably isn't an arrow that's pointing us in that direction. I think it's something that we could, with the right intention, we can probably quickly rectify in terms of policy, which is the key driver. I think one of the things around inclusive design is taking the decision to do it or not do it away from people. So you build it into your policy, you build it into your strategies, and it gets done like magic. It generally costs you maybe 1% of your project cost more to utilize universal design principles, 1 to 2%. So it's around that. You're spot on. It's that policy key. That policy is key and is the driving force. And I think from what I've seen of the updated General Purpose Resource Management Plan, it has been mentioned in there more as a result of the feedback from myself and CCS and others, which is really good. However, there's a raft of policy that we should be looking to update and include this in, as it really will point us in that direction moving forward.
Thank you.
Mayor Clark?
Just a couple of things. You made a couple of statements that seemed to conflict with me. So you sort of went down the line of saying all reserves should be of similar access, I guess, as opposed to just 2 or 3 big ones. So in our city, we've got 70 plus reserves and parks, probably per capita higher than anywhere else. So the cost of having wheelchair access to all 70 reserves and parks would be astronomical.
My question to that would be, do you not think people should access those reserves?
No, I didn't say that. What I'm saying is, if you want to make disability access to all 74 parks, and given that some of these parks do not lend themselves to people with mobility issues, for argument's sake, there has to be some limitation on where you can afford to put in, because there is a significant cost. It'd be more than 1% of a project cost if I was to do a bush track out through Sandy Point that allowed people to mountain bike / walk a dog / walk, and then I start considering wheelchairs and other things as well. It would be more than 1% of the cost.
I think you take an approach where your aspiration is to design people in, and
Yep.
I wouldn't be suggesting that we go out tomorrow and all 70 odd reserves are fixed overnight, because the cost would be huge if
Sure.
you do it, if you take that approach.
Yep.
But building those values into your design principles, into your outcomes, means that over time we will see that change. So yes, we may work with CCS to target, or other agencies to target, what cabs are first off the rank, but we will then implement these values into projects moving forward. There will always be some challenges, there will always be some cost, but I think it's really important to consider, when we put cost in front of people as the only barrier or the only important asset, where are we heading as a society if we're doing that? It's a big question that's not for today, but I think it's really important when we're talking about policy and setting a direction, to previous councillors' points.
So 2 other questions for you. Thank
Other
you, Chair.
questions?
Yeah, absolutely.
Excellent.
Yep. So you made reference to sports and maintenance of sports fields and other things. So what's your take on the future of junior sports? Like, I can tell you that all sports, and I mean all sports, with one exception, or 2 exceptions, which is football and the climbing fraternity that climb on the wall down at the stadium, are in reclining numbers. So how do we factor in being active and giving access to facilities that are changing?
I think that's a really good question, and it is a true observation that participation in sport generally is declining.
Yep.
Part of our remit as an organisation is to ensure people stay active. We don't have all of the answers, and I think there's so many interesting examples where if you look back 20 years ago, I think the idea of having a frisbee golf course aligned with Queen's Park Golf Club would have been mind-blowing to people.
Yeah,
Sure.
But that's a key way that people are still active. And I think that's a great example of how the changing nature of sport and recreation activity, what the changing face of it looks like. And we have to be prepared to be flexible and ensure that we design spaces to be flexible, to flex to future needs that we're maybe not seeing yet. To make sure that those places and the investment in that stays relevant.
And so the last question is a statement and a question just for Darren's perspective. Unlike Leslie, I have walked across that blue matting at Papamau Beach. But the other issue is that we tend to cluster the disability sector as one sector, when in fact it's not, as you well know. And so one of the issues I guess we deal with council, which I'd like your thoughts on, is that the disability sector quite rightly claim they have about 23% of the community are disabled in one shape or another, or the disability sector. But that covers a huge range, so there'll be people here that fall into that category because they wear glasses, for argument's sake. But then when you talk about the deaf and the blind and other things as well, it's a very complex area. So how do we break down that lobby group, for want of a better word, and facilitate for them when we think about reserves and parks?
It's a very good question, and the number, the 23 or 27% that come from the census data are self-identified disability. So you look at the questions, and some of them are: can you tie your shoelaces unassisted? Do you believe your vision is poor enough for? So you're right. It's a very broad spectrum when you go from that, and you include your intellectual impairment groups, your physical impairment groups. It's very broad, and people do have some differences on how they think the world should look. My suggestion is that universal design principles, in terms of reserves and the role that council can play, is a really great way of including everybody, because it's very hard to meet individual needs. To talk to one person and they'll say, I want A, B, C, D. Talk to a second person and they want 1, 2, and 3. So they're completely different. They're not even talking the same language at times. And that, my observation from my previous role would be at council, at times, you can end up listening to individual preferences, not what's better for the collective. And I would suggest that for where we are at the moment, universal design principles is the best collective approach that can be taken to cater for as many people as possible.
Okay, thank you.
Trish, then Evelyn.
Just with reference to Queen's Park, I love that you said that we need to activate it more. Last Tuesday night, I went home.
This is leading to a question, isn't it, Trish?
It is. Sort
Excellent.
of. It is. I went home past Queen's Park, and the council with a Rotary group had arranged for Halloween in the park. 1,000 kids across town, not just one area. What can you do? It's probably not quite relevant, but what can you do to make sure that kind of thing happens with partnerships? Because we were doing our bit, but we need the community to also come to that.
Yeah, I think that's a great example of where you have to look at cross-organisation partnerships, and where Active Southland and ICC can formalise some of our working together around those projects, and where it may or may not be our role to do particular parts of that, but we have great relationships with a number of community groups to bring them to the table as well, to ensure that those activations are interesting, relevant, vibrant, and we're getting people using our reserves, as you say, because it's such a nice feeling when you walk through a space and there's people there having a nice time. It's
Sort of a question.
Evelyn.
Promise I'll ask a question.
Good.
I recognise that your brief is to talk about activity, but given that we're all different, which you've acknowledged as well, in this particular conversation, where does challenging come in? So if and I don't mean to be disrespectful of anybody because I'm really limited in my mobility in some ways, but where does challenging people's abilities come in this conversation? Because some of it, in our ambition to be inclusive, can we actually dumb it down? Or does that mean that the city shouldn't be providing the more challenging experiences? That should be somebody else. This is not meant to be offensive to anybody. It's my thinking is where does the more challenging walks, or where does the Mayor's example of the climbing frames, where does that fit in this? It's an activity, but it's never going to be accessible to everybody. You know, should we exclude them because it's not?
It's a great question, and I think that there are organisations such as Recreation Aotearoa that are doing some great work in that space. They're building frameworks and they're building examples of how you can include people in spaces but without taking the challenge away from it. So I think it's really my personal perspective, having worked Paralympics New Zealand as well, is that you need people to challenge themselves. You need to create environments where people feel that they can push their limits and sometimes fail. That's really important. And where it is not the council's role is probably to look at the evidence that's out there and to decide where investment is spent, and to ensure that where possible we're creating inclusive environments. It doesn't mean that there's not challenge in there. It doesn't mean there's not scaled opportunities. You know, there's if I think about, I don't know, activity I did on the weekend, I went for a run at Seaward Bush, but if I'm not particularly fit. If I was less fit, I could have done half a loop rather than a full loop. So it's scalable and it's flexible, and I think that's how we can look at providing challenge to people at different physical ability levels, and ensure that everybody has an opportunity to be included. They may choose not to be. They may choose not to access those reserves, but if they do, is there something they can access? Is there something they can be a part of? And from a strategy perspective, looking at the evidence that is available to us, that's being done by good work done by other organisations such as Sport New Zealand and Active Recreation Aotearoa.
So if we had a target of say 75% of our reserves being fully accessible, which may or may not be easily achievable, but for instance, I look at Otapuni Gardens, and not all of them are freely accessible because of the inclines and the steps. But if we made sure that one of the Otapuni Gardens was fully accessible, would that be meeting it, being fair? Or, you know, because there's reasons why they're not accessible, including stop banks, which provide some safety and security for our infrastructure. So, you know,
I think it'd be naive of me to try and give specific examples. I don't know the reserve, and I think there may or may not be design solutions that could overcome those barriers, and that would be where I'd start. Can we design our way out of the challenge? If not, what's the best we can do? And that may be part of it is accessible, that maybe we can make it completely accessible with some really smart design. People smarter than me can come up with that. But it's about looking at it with that. If you take that lens of can we do it, you'll end up somewhere that's better than never asking the question. That would be my suggestion.
Thank you for challenging my thinking, and thank you for coming and presenting. I appreciate it.
No worries.
Thank you, Kieran. Thank you, Jess. We may have gone from 4 to 1 person or organisation speaking to their submission, but I think the quality of your presentation has been impressive and welcome. So thank you very much for taking the time.
Thank you very much.
And once again, welcome to town. You have until next week to familiarise yourself with all our reserves.
You go and visit Otapuni Gardens.
Councillors, that brings us to the recommendations, because we're not deliberating today. We were just it was just scheduled to hear the submissions. So the recommendations are one, that we received the reports, General Policies Reserve Management Plan hearings, that we received the submissions, including the submission that we've heard. We agreed to receive a late submission received from Britt Barr. We note the summary of submissions and the hearing schedule, which was reduced to just Kieran and Jess from Active South. And
I'll
would somebody
move all
like to move
those,
those?
Mr. Chair.
Moved by Leslie and Evelyn. Any discussion on that? Bearing in mind that discussion on the issues raised will actually come up when we get to deliberation. If not, I'll put the motion. All in favour?
Aye.
Thank you. For those who had the pleasure of joining us on Zoom, thank you for your attention. And I will adjourn this hearing.